The discovery of Michael's wallet, its contents a heartbreaking timestamp of their last moments, was not the only piece of evidence to emerge from the silent undergrowth. As the search team widened its perimeter, their trained eyes scanning for any anomaly, a pattern began to form. A piece of a broken trekking pole here, a faded patch of a backpack there. It was as if a trail of breadcrumbs had been left, not by the victims, but by the perpetrator, a sloppy attempt at concealment in a place so vast and remote that it was assumed no one would ever look. The scattered nature of the evidence was a puzzle. It suggested not a single point of attack, but a protracted event, a forced march through the unforgiving terrain. This new narrative was far more horrifying than the initial theory of a quick and merciful death by exposure. It painted a picture of two young people, possibly injured or threatened, being led deeper and deeper into the wilderness. The psychological toll of this new reality was immeasurable, not just on the families, but on the investigators themselves. They were no longer dealing with the aftermath of a natural disaster, but with the premeditated cruelty of a human being. The focus of the investigation shifted dramatically. The Park Service, once leading the charge, now worked hand-in-hand with state police and the FBI. This was no longer a search and rescue operation. It was a homicide investigation. The meticulous, almost forensic, examination of the site began. The area was cordoned off, marked with grids and strings, each square foot of earth sifted through for any fragment of a story. A small, tarnished silver pendant, shaped like a bird in flight, was found nestled in the roots of a spruce tree. Michael had given it to Claire for her 21st birthday. The families were notified of the new developments. The news a crushing blow layered with a strange, unsettling sense of vindication. Their gut feeling, the silent, persistent suspicion that something more sinister had happened, was finally being acknowledged. The hope of a quick and easy answer was replaced by the dread of a difficult and painful truth. The physical evidence, though sparse, was eloquent in its silence. The location of the wallet, the pendant, and the other scattered items pointed to a specific, localized area. The search narrowed, becoming a methodical excavation of the forest floor. The ground itself, with its thick layer of pine needles and decaying leaves, was a natural camouflage, a perfect grave. The discovery of a small, rusted arrowhead, half buried in the mud near a small, trickling stream, was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. It was not a primitive hunting tool, but a modern, machined arrowhead, the kind used for target practice or hunting small game. It was a bizarre and seemingly irrelevant detail, but it would later prove to be a crucial link to a new line of inquiry. The presence of such a modern artifact, in a place so remote and untouched, spoke volumes. It was not a random item. It was a weapon. The discovery of the arrowhead, coupled with the other scattered belongings, gave the investigators a new direction. They began to look for signs of a makeshift camp, a temporary shelter where the couple might have been held. They found it a few hundred yards from the initial discovery site, a crude lean-to made from branches and a small, faded tarp. But this was not the end of the story. The lean-to, they soon realized, was not built by Michael and Claire. The construction was different, more primitive, and the materials used were not from their gear. The initial shock of finding a potential crime scene began to give way to a far more chilling realization. This was not the scene of a single brutal act. It was the scene of something far more complex, a narrative that had been carefully constructed by a third party. The presence of the lean-to, so close to the other evidence, suggested a period of confinement. Michael and Claire hadn't been killed instantly. They had been held. The thought of their final days, of the fear and the desperation they must have felt, was a horrifying and almost unbearable thing to contemplate. The arrowhead, the lean-to, the carefully scattered belongings, each piece of evidence was a breadcrumb leading the investigators to a truth more sinister than they had ever imagined. The case was no longer a simple search for two missing hikers. It was an elaborate and terrifying puzzle, a carefully orchestrated narrative of control and cruelty. The vast, empty wilderness, once a symbol of freedom, was now a backdrop for a story of human depravity. The search for Michael and Claire had entered its final, most devastating phase. It was no longer a search for life, or even for remains. It was a search for a story, a narrative of a crime so cold and calculated that it defied belief. The silence of the mountains, which had held the secret for so long, was finally beginning to yield its gruesome truth. The world had waited 3 years for an answer, and the answer, when it finally began to reveal itself, was more tragic and horrifying than anyone could have possibly imagined. The case of Michael and Claire was about to become a story not just of a disappearance, but of a monstrous and incomprehensible evil. The methodical excavation of the forest floor continued, each scoop of earth a potential window into the past, each sifted rock a possibility of a new clue. The investigators, now operating with the grim certainty of a homicide case, worked with a different kind of focus. The hope that had once fueled them was gone, replaced by a cold, unwavering determination to find the truth, to give a voice to the 2 people who had been silenced so completely. The discovery of the lean-to and the arrowhead had shifted the entire narrative, and the new line of inquiry was built on a single, terrifying premise: that Michael and Claire had been taken and held for a period of time before their deaths. This was not a random encounter. It was something far more deliberate, far more chilling. The search for remains, which had been a desperate hope for closure, now took on a new, more urgent meaning. The bodies themselves would be the most eloquent witnesses, able to speak of the precise manner of their deaths, and, perhaps, provide forensic evidence that could lead to the killer. The search area was expanded, a human chain of investigators slowly moving through the dense forest, their eyes on the ground, their minds replaying the known events. And then a new discovery, a small, carefully constructed pile of rocks, not a natural formation, was found on a small, elevated rise overlooking a stream. It was the kind of pile a hunter or a lost hiker might build to mark a trail, but its placement, its meticulous construction, felt wrong. It felt deliberate, a message from the past. The lead investigator, a veteran with a career's worth of experience in both search and rescue and homicide, felt a prickle of unease. He knelt down, his gloved hands gently pushing the rocks aside. Beneath them, buried shallowly in the earth, was a small metal box, the kind used for waterproof storage. He lifted it out, the weight of it feeling like a premonition. He carefully pried it open. Inside, wrapped in a plastic bag, were 2 small, carefully folded pieces of paper. They were handwritten notes. The first note, written in a shaky but recognizable hand, was from Claire. The words were a frantic, desperate plea, a plea for help addressed to no one in particular. It spoke of their capture of the man who had taken them, and of their fear. The details were sparse but devastating. The captor was a reclusive woodsman, a man who lived off the grid, who had taken them not for robbery or revenge, but out of a twisted, incomprehensible desire for company. He saw them as a gift, 2 young souls to share his isolated existence. The second note was from Michael. It was more methodical, more composed, a chillingly precise narrative of their ordeal. He described their captor in vivid detail, his unkempt appearance, his strangely eloquent and philosophical pronouncements about the evils of modern society. He described the lean-to where they were held, the stream where they were allowed to drink, the constant, suffocating presence of their captor, who watched them with an unnerving, proprietary gaze. He spoke of the arrowhead, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of their captor's worldview, a rejection of the modern world. Michael's note ended with a final, desperate act of defiance. He wrote of their plan to escape, of a desperate, fleeting chance they saw to overpower their captor and flee into the forest. He knew the risk, and the note was a testament to his courage, a final, poignant message to his family, a final, heartbreaking admission of his love for Claire. The notes were a profound, gut-wrenching gift. They filled in the blanks, turning a cold case into a chillingly human tragedy. They explained the location of the scattered evidence, the presence of the lean-to, the absence of a struggle. The couple had not been killed on sight. They had been taken, held, and then, in their brave, futile attempt to escape, They had paid the ultimate price. The narrative was now complete, but the ending was still missing. The notes provided a crucial direction for the investigation. They described the man, his habits, his beliefs, his camp. It was no longer a search for a nameless monster. It was a search for a specific person, the reclusive woodsman, the man who had been hiding in the shadows of the Wrangell St. Elias National Park for years. The notes, though they offered a glimpse into their final days, also raised a new, more difficult question. What happened after they tried to escape? The answer, the investigators knew, would be even more difficult to bear. The emotional weight of the discovery was immense. The families, upon hearing the contents of the notes, were shattered anew, but also given a measure of closure. The long-held suspicion that their children had not been lost to the elements, but to the cruelty of a fellow human being, was confirmed. The notes were a final farewell, a final act of love and courage, a final, desperate cry from the heart of the silent wilderness. The hunt for the reclusive woodsman began in earnest, but it was a hunt for a ghost. The notes gave them a name, a nickname, really the Hermit. But the vastness of the park, the very thing that had allowed him to exist undetected for so long, was now his greatest ally. The notes, a final, poignant plea from the grave, had brought the investigation full circle, from a baffling disappearance to a brutal and deeply personal crime. The narrative was no longer a mystery, but a tragedy. The hunt for justice, however, had just begun. The notes, now carefully preserved and analyzed by a team of forensic document examiners, with a key that unlocked the entire case. The handwriting, though shaky, was a positive match for Michael and Claire. The information they contained, the vivid and terrifying account of their capture and confinement, provided a precise and chilling timeline. For a period of weeks, perhaps even months, the two young adventurers had been held captive in the vast and unforgiving wilderness, their freedom and their lives held in the hands of a man who saw them not as human beings, but as objects, as trophies in his private world. The note spoke of a strange and unsettling coexistence, of a captor who was sometimes kind, sometimes cruel, and always possessive. He would bring them food, engage them in long, rambling monologues about the decline of society, and then, without warning, he would become distant, his eyes filled with a simmering resentment. The psychological torment they must have endured was unimaginable. The notes had given the investigators a name, the Hermit, and a description, a rough but detailed portrait of their captor. They now had a mission, to find a man who had been living on the fringes of society, a ghost in the wilderness, for years. The hunt for the Hermit was a massive undertaking, a coordinated effort between the FBI, the Alaska State Troopers, and the Park Service. They began by sifting through old park records, looking for any reports of a reclusive individual, any strange encounters or sightings. They interviewed hunters, prospectors, and other park visitors, their questions now focused on a specific kind of person. They looked for someone who fit the description in the notes, someone with an unusual affinity for the wilderness and a deep-seated distrust of the outside world. The search was slow and painstaking. The vastness of the park was a significant obstacle, and the anonymity of its inhabitants was a wall. But the notes had given them a precise location for the Hermit's camp, a small, isolated area deep in the woods. They organized a full-scale search operation, a team of investigators and trained canines descending on the specified coordinates. What they found was both a confirmation of the notes and a chilling end to the search. The camp was just as Michael had described, a small, well-maintained cabin, built from logs and salvaged materials, a testament to the man's ingenuity and his commitment to living off the grid. Inside, the cabin was a trove of evidence, a museum of a life lived in isolation. There were shelves lined with books, journals filled with rambling, paranoid entries, and a small collection of strange and macabre artifacts. But there was no sign of the Hermit himself. The cabin felt as if it had been abandoned in a hurry, left in a state of disarray that was uncharacteristic of its otherwise meticulous occupant. A closer examination of the area around the cabin revealed a fresh trail, leading away from the camp and deeper into the woods. The canines, now with a scent to follow, took off in pursuit. The trail was difficult, leading through thick brush and over rocky terrain, a testament to the man's skill at navigating his own private world. The chase lasted for hours, the investigators pushing themselves to their limits, their minds racing with the possibilities. They knew he was running, but they didn't know why. Had he seen them coming? Had he been warned? The answer, when it came, was as sudden and final as a gunshot. The trail ended at the edge of a deep, fast-moving river. On the riverbank, partially submerged in the water, they found the remains of a small, homemade raft. A single, muddy footprint was found on the muddy bank, a clear indication that he had not been gone long. The hermit had escaped, vanishing once again into the unforgiving Alaskan wilderness. The discovery was a bitter pill to swallow. They had found the man's home, the evidence of his crime, but the man himself was gone, swallowed by the same vastness that had claimed his victims. The search was called off, but the investigation was far from over. The evidence collected from the cabin, and the journals found inside, provided a new and far more sinister picture of the hermit's motives. The man, a former military veteran suffering from severe PTSD and a deep-seated paranoia, saw Michael and Claire not as people, but as symbols, as representatives of a world he had long ago rejected. He had taken them not out of a desire for companionship, but out of a need to prove his own strength, his own ability to survive and thrive in a world that he believed had failed him. The notes, and the evidence from the cabin, made it clear that Michael and Claire had tried to escape, and that their attempted escape had ended in tragedy. The journals contained a final, horrifying entry, a rambling and barely coherent account of the struggle of the final moments of their lives. The bodies, however, were still missing. The search for the remains of Michael and Claire became a grim, final mission. The notes had spoken of a specific location, a small clearing near a waterfall. The investigators, their hearts heavy, made their way to the location, their minds already bracing for the worst. And there, in a shallow, makeshift grave, they found them. The final pieces of the puzzle. Michael and Claire, their bodies finally at rest, their story finally complete. The discovery was a profound and sorrowful moment, a quiet ending to a 3-year-long ordeal. The cause of death, confirmed by forensic analysis, was blunt force trauma. Their desperate, final act of courage had been met with a violent and brutal end. The case was closed, but the story of Michael and Claire, of the 2 young adventurers who vanished into the wilderness and became a footnote in a larger, more sinister tale, would forever haunt the landscape of Wrangell St. Elias. The hermit was never found, swallowed by the vastness he had chosen as his sanctuary. But the truth of what he had done, the chilling story of Michael and Claire's final days, was finally known, a tragic, heartbreaking testament to the power of courage and the enduring shadow of human evil. With the discovery of the remains and the damning evidence from the hermit's cabin, the story of Michael and Claire, once a baffling mystery, was now a solved, albeit tragic, case. But the narrative wasn't truly complete. The final, horrifying piece of the puzzle lay in the cold, unfeeling prose of the journals found in the hermit's cabin. The writings were a descent into madness, a long, winding account of a man who had lost his way in the world and sought a twisted form of solace in isolation. His name, discovered through old military records and confirmed by fingerprint analysis of the cabin's contents, was Elias Vance. He had been a decorated soldier, a man who had seen the worst of humanity and, in his mind, had chosen to escape it. But the wilderness, for all its beauty, had not offered him peace. It had amplified his paranoia, his deep-seated resentments, and his belief that the outside world was a plague to be avoided at all costs. The notes from Michael and Claire, for all their despair, had hinted at a captor who was a philosophical figure, a man of bizarre and unsettling principles. Elias's journals confirmed this. He wrote of Michael and Claire not as people, but as symbols of the world he hated, their youthful optimism, their modern equipment, their easy confidence. He saw their journey into his domain as an intrusion, a violation of his sacred, self-imposed isolation. He believed he was saving them, not from the wilderness, but from the corrupting influence of the modern world. His plan, as pieced together from the scattered, fragmented entries, was to rehabilitate them, to teach them the true meaning of freedom, which, in his deranged mind, was a life of complete self-sufficiency and solitude. The notes and the journals together painted a picture of a tragic miscalculation, a collision of two vastly different worldviews in the heart of a vast and indifferent landscape. Michael and Claire, with their hope and their courage, were a direct threat to Elias's fragile, self-constructed reality. Their planned escape was not just a desperate attempt at survival. It was a rejection of his entire philosophy, a final act of defiance that he could not tolerate. The manner of their deaths, as documented in the final, chilling journal entry, was not a cold, calculated murder, but a furious, unhinged act of passion. Elias had found them attempting to steal a canoe he had hidden near the riverbank. In a moment of blinding rage, he had struck them down. The journal entry, scrawled in a barely legible hand, spoke of a deep-seated regret, a fleeting moment of clarity in which he realized the horror of what he had done. But the regret was quickly consumed by his paranoia, and he fled, a ghost once again, into the silent vastness of the park. The search for Elias Vance, now a full-blown manhunt, continued for months. The FBI and the state troopers, using helicopters and drones equipped with thermal imaging, combed the park, their efforts hampered by the oncoming winter and the vastness of the terrain. They found no trace of him. No makeshift camp, no footprints in the snow, nothing. Elias Vance, the hermit, had truly vanished. The case, however, was officially closed. The victims had been found, the perpetrator identified, and the story of what had happened to them was finally known. The families of Michael and Claire, in a final, poignant act, held a memorial service at the edge of the Wrangell St. Elias National Park, a place that once symbolized adventure and now held the weight of an unspeakable tragedy. A small bronze plaque was placed on a large, lichen-covered rock near the entrance to the trail they had planned to take. It bore their names and the dates of their lives, a quiet tribute to two young souls who had dared to dream and had been met with a nightmare. The plaque was a final, silent testament to their lives, a solemn marker in a vast and beautiful landscape that held a terrible secret. For the investigators who worked the case, the image of Michael and Claire, their young, smiling faces in their last known photograph, would forever be linked to the dark, silent forest of Wrangell St. Elias. The case had changed them, a grim reminder of the thin, fragile line between human ingenuity and human depravity. The vast, empty wilderness, once a symbol of freedom, now felt like a tomb, a silent monument to a tragic, incomprehensible act of evil. The mystery of their disappearance was solved, but the deeper, more unsettling questions of what drives a man to such a state of isolation and cruelty, of what happens to the human soul when it is left untethered and alone, would forever remain unanswered, lost to the silent, unyielding expanse of the Alaskan wild. The story of Michael and Claire, of their tragic final journey, became a cautionary tale, a somber reminder that in the most beautiful and remote corners of the world, a darkness can lurk, waiting to consume the unsuspecting and the brave. The final chapter of the Michael and Claire story was not one of closure, but of a lingering, unsettling question mark. The bodies had been found, the killer identified, but Elias Vance himself had simply ceased to exist, swallowed by the same unforgiving landscape that had claimed his victims. The official report, a thick, meticulously detailed document, concluded with a declaration of his presumed death, a grim but necessary formality. But for the investigators who had spent months chasing his shadow, the feeling was one of profound unease. A man capable of such cruelty, so skilled at survival, did not simply disappear without a trace. The vastness of Wrangell St. Elias was his sanctuary, his home, and they were the interlopers. The hunt for Elias became a testament to his mastery of the wilderness, a final, chilling demonstration of his control over his domain. He had outsmarted them, not with a weapon or a plan, but with the very thing he had used to isolate himself from the world, the silent, indifferent wilderness. The narrative of Michael and Claire was no longer just a true crime story. It was a ghost story, a tale of a man who became one with the unforgiving landscape he had chosen as his tomb. The memory of the case lingered, a dark shadow over the park, a quiet warning to all who dared to venture too far off the beaten path. For years to come, hunters and hikers would share whispered tales of a fleeting glimpse of a lone figure in the distance, a man with a wild look in his eye, a ghost in the trees. The myth of the hermit of Wrangell St. Elias was born, a grim and haunting folklore woven into the fabric of the park itself. The case served as a stark and sobering reminder of the dangers that lie hidden in the quiet places of the world, not just from the elements, but from the darkness that can take root in the human heart. The story of Michael and Claire was a tragedy, a heartbreaking account of a young couple's dreams turning into a nightmare. But it was also a testament to their courage, their final, defiant act of resistance against an incomprehensible evil. The notes, buried so carefully in the cold, unfeeling earth, were a final message to the world, a last cry for help and a final act of love. They had been silenced, but their story, their terrifying and ultimately triumphant story, was finally told. The case was a stark and powerful lesson in the brutal realities of the wild, a final, somber note on the danger that lies not just in the fangs of a bear or the biting wind of a blizzard, but in the most unpredictable and terrifying of all creatures, a fellow human being, lost and alone in the wilderness, with a heart as cold and unforgiving as the landscape itself. The story of Michael and Claire was over, but its legacy, the quiet, haunting unease that lingers in the air of Wrangell St. Elias, would remain forever. A silent and somber reminder that even in the most beautiful places on earth, a monster can make its home, and the most dangerous journey of all is the one into the depths of a human heart.